Our second section of 2 Corinthians covers chapter 1, verse 12 through chapter 2, verse 17. And we get into some more of the details now about what Paul is really talking about and a little more of the tension that has come to be. Apparently, Paul had said, I'm going to come and I'm going to visit you. Apparently he said that as he made what is called a painful visit. He had a very difficult time with a visit with them, one where there was no resolution of the problems that they were addressing, maybe a problem where some people had called Paul's teaching into question. That's up for a lot of discussion. But apparently he had said, I'll come back soon to see you, and then he thought better of it. And he decided instead of coming that he was going to send a letter so they could kind of have maybe the time to reflect on what he was saying rather than to be fighting with words and maybe having facial expressions and the energy of the moment make things even worse yet. Well, Paul had said, I'm going to come from where I am, which apparently was in Turkey, western Turkey. He kind of said, I'm going to come across and I'm going to come over to see you in Corinth, and then I'm going to go up to Macedonia, which is the northern part of Greece, and I'm going to collect from them the offering that we are promising to take to Judea. And then he said, I plan to come back and see you on the way back. Those people who were trying to find fault with every single possible thing they could find fault with said, you see, the guy can't even keep his word about a visit. He said he was going to come see us and then go up to Macedonia. Instead, he writes a letter, and he goes north toward Macedonia, and Troas is right up north. It's on the way toward Macedonia. In fact, it's in Troas that Acts tells us that Paul had a vision from a man from Macedonia saying, come over and visit us. So instead of Paul going across and then up from Corinth to get the offering in Macedonia, which is the northern part of Greece, and then back south, he apparently went along the coast of Turkey, got up to Troas, went up to Macedonia when he said, I didn't find my friend Titus there, and then as he hears that there is dissension about him in Corinth, in response to this letter that he had written, he writes still another letter. And that's part of what we have here, where he becomes very defensive. His defensiveness is because he says, there is no honest way that I can convince you what's in my heart. If you want to find fault with me, you're going to find fault with me. If you think that you have a better idea about what the teaching of the faith is than what I have, then you're going to find fault with every single thing about me, and what you're trying to do, some of you in the congregation, is to have a character assassination. That goes all the way back to the first letter to the Corinthians, where some wanted Paul and some Apollos and some Cephas and some Christ, where they had differing views about who was the one to listen to. Paul says the point of it is to listen to the gospel, not to listen to who the speaker is and whether you like the speaker or not. Is the gospel being presented? And so as he begins this section now in the first verses in 12 to 14, he says, how can we possibly show you what's in our heart? You already have a bad opinion. You already are looking for the worst, and you're looking for it any way you can. All I can do is say that I live by godly sincerity and by holiness. In the presence of God, I'm telling you that I came here in that painful visit thinking I was going to come back soon. But then I reflected on it and said maybe a little bit more time and a little bit more words from me might heal the dissension you have about my teaching, which has caused some people to say that they don't think that I'm trustworthy. And so I did it with no malice. I did it on purpose. And I did it because I wanted to have joy with you and that we can share in our ministry. You're my pride. You're my joy. How is it that you're the ones who are finding fault with me when I go and boast about you to everyone else? And so he says, there's no way except by saying it and trying to have you hear it that I'm sincere in Christ. I'm going to be proud of you on the day of Christ when he comes, that we've been able to work together in the gospel. But if you start finding fault with my teaching, and if you say that I don't represent Christ but just myself, and maybe even a distortion of God, then I have nothing else to say except that I tell you what's deep in my heart. And so as Paul is getting at this, we might just note a little bit about what he means by the day of Christ. In the Old Testament, the day of the Lord was the day when God acted to save his people. The most common uh, mindset for the people would be that this was the day when God had passed over the homes of those who had the blood on the doorposts, and the angel of death passed by, and then right after that, how the sea was parted and Israel was saved. So the day of the Lord at first was the day when God saved his people. But by the time you get into the prophetic literature, Amos is one example of this from about the 760s before Christ. We find the prophets saying the day of the Lord is going to come when you are not the friends of God, but you are the enemies because you've turned away. And the prophets, in their great anguish, talk about the dilemma that the people are in because they've turned from God. And there's an ancient Latin hymn, Dies irae, dies ille, day of wrath, O dreadful day that comes, where God comes as the enemy. Now Paul says because Christ died and took the consequences of our sin, now the day of Christ, which would mean Judgment Day, the last day when the Lord appears, is going to be a day when my sincerity is going to be shown. So he's really kind of claiming that in the presence of God, he has not done anything wrong, and that he's willing to stand before God on the day of judgment to assert the truthfulness of what he said. And he tells them, you're going to find out on that day of judgment just what was in my heart. He goes on in chapter 1, verses 15 to 22, then to talk a little bit more about this trip. And we have some very common, ordinary uh, travel descriptions here. He says, originally I wanted to stop by to see you on the way to Macedonia, Upper Greece. They had made a promise, and the churches up there would be like Thessalonica and Philippi and Berea, churches that are mentioned in the book of Acts as Paul is being chased by Jewish people who didn't want him teaching the faith. Later he'll have trouble with Christians who think that there were some things in Judaism that they should retain. The Galatian churches in eastern Turkey will act that way. But here he had to keep one step ahead of the Jews who were trying to kill him, and he didn't stay very long in any of those places, and then got himself down to Athens, and then down to Corinth, where he had lived for a year and a half. So these people are not brand new to him. It's not like he had seen them once or twice. Living with them a year and a half already, he had a pretty good idea who they were, and they had a pretty good idea who he was. But after he left, then there were people who came in and said, well, the guy's worthless, let's not follow him any longer. And so he says, I'm not a person who says yes when I mean no, or no when I mean yes. And then he diverts very quickly into saying that you can treat me like you treat the Lord. In God, God's word to us is always yes. We can be trusting God that when he says, I love you, I forgive you, I'll have you with me forever, that's a word on which you can stand. It may be here that we get the understanding that there were some people who were saying, you better not be so sure about whether you're saved or not. This Paul's gospel is a little too easy. He hasn't told you the whole story. And there may be some of that that's there. But he says, in him, in Christ, God always says yes, and that God is the one who has established Paul in the faith and has commissioned Paul and Timothy, who together are writing this letter, to go and preach the message. So Paul once again says, I'm under authority. It's not like I've come tooting my own horn, trying to make some money. You know I didn't take any money from you. But as I came, it was because God sent me on a mission to go and tell the gospel where it hadn't been told before. And that's how I came to you. And now he says the Spirit of God can give witness that that's why we were there. And we were being as honest as we could be with you. It's painful for us to see that there is difference of opinion between us and you on what the gospel is and how we have lived it out. But all he can do is claim that in the Spirit of God he's been commissioned and try to help them recognize what the apostolic ministry is all about. Then the very last couple of verses in chapter 1 and on into the first part of chapter 2, he says that his goal is not to try to lord it over others, but to be involved with the people in Corinth in serving. So there's this tricky kind of a balance. On the one hand, to further talk about what the faith is and lead the people, not to say, well, you're all together the way you are, and yet not to say that he is the one who's got all the answers and has lived them out perfectly in his life. So he says, I'm not here because I'm trying to show you that I'm the only righteous one and that you're not. I'm here to lead you, and when you put my words into a setting where it looks like I'm not really talking the faith, and that you are the only ones who are, then you've mistaken who I am as one under authority to represent the Lord at this point. So he says the reason why we didn't come had nothing to do with us not being true or honest. I had a change of heart. And apparently he wrote them about that. And he said, I just don't want to hurt you. I don't want to come in anger. I want to come in love to you because we've started out wonderfully in the faith together. And we're growing and you're growing. And remember, he called them saints. But at this point, he says, I just plain had a second thought about it after I wrote a letter instead. And now I'm writing another letter. And it is because of your benefit, because I want you to know that all of the anguish and affliction and the pain that I've gone through is on your behalf because I love you so dearly. It's nothing to do with the fact that I'm not a faithful person or you can't trust me. Then the next section that he gets into, 2 verses 5 to 11, he says that it pains him terribly that he has heard that there is dissension within the congregation. Now apparently what's going on here is some man, it used to be that they would suggest this was the man who was committing adultery with his stepmother, a young second wife of his father, but others today would say that maybe that's not the case. It may be someone we just don't know who was being so divisive and somehow contradicting the faith in such a way that Paul told them to stay away from such a person, and that apparently their reaction to him worked and that he came back, and now they were told that they would be in a position to forgive him. And Paul says, if you forgive him and realize he's back in the fold, I don't want him to have the anguish of eternal death in his heart. Love him and forgive him and comfort him. I just wanted to find out, would you really take seriously the things that I wrote you about? Remember that apparently we don't have that letter. And I hate to say apparently so much, but there's a lot of guesswork in all the Corinthian correspondence. It may be that that letter that he's talking about that we do not have, the one where he wrote a letter instead of coming to visit, is the one that he's referring to now, where he said about somebody that they were to treat an individual as an unbeliever. And again, we don't know the circumstances of it, but he says, I'll forgive them too in the presence of Christ. I'll trust your judgment. So he comes back and he affirms them. He says, it's not that you're not in the faith. You are. But I am too. And let's together look at how we can live out our life and recognize the presence of the Lord with you and with me as well. And he says the reason why we have to do this is because Satan is up to his tricks. He's trying to see if he can find ways to put division within the church, to make people choose whether they're going to listen to Paul or not, and to say that Paul speaks and others don't. Now, everyone is called to evaluate their teaching. And the truth of the matter is that on any given moment or at any given time, someone indeed might say something that upon reflection would not be the most adequate way of stating the gospel. But Paul says that's where, if it is unintended, then let's go on from there and let's see if there aren't ways in which we can say it more clearly, act more clearly, see ourselves on the same track, and mutually walk together, which is what we do and what we seek to do as a church body, that we try to see if we can listen to one another and find a way in which we are representing the Lord and not just ourselves, and remaining as his servants, neither as those who wander away or those who believe that their word is word even when it might not be reflective of the gospel of Christ. And so it's not just personality, but it's does this proclaim Christ's death and resurrection. Paul comes back to that over and over again. I told you about Christ. I didn't preach myself. Uh, the next section, 2 verses 12 to 17, then is when Paul says, well, I wrote you that letter for your good. I explained to you why I was writing the letter, that I wasn't just making up a lie and saying, well, I don't care about you anymore, so I'll just drop you a line and not come for a visit. And he says that then he went north to Troas and he looked for Titus. He says, I was trying to tell the gospel and share the news in northwestern Turkey about the good news of Christ, but I was so concerned about Titus that now we remember that Titus is one who later receives a letter from Paul. He's one of the pastoral letters. He's the recipient of that. And later he would have had a ministry down in the Mediterranean. But at this point he is up in the northern part of Greece. And Paul apparently evidently found him somewhere up in Macedonia, whether in Thessalonica or in Philippi or maybe in Berea. But as he finds him and checks with the churches, then he has also occasion to hear that there were problems in the Corinthian congregation where they had caused trouble and were causing trouble about Paul not having appeared to them. So one would almost suspect that it is up from that area that he is now writing to them. And he says, wherever I've gone proclaiming the good news. It is like a fragrant offering. It's an aroma. And here he kind of plays a little interesting game, because he says it's a fragrance or an aroma that is very pleasing to the people who are being saved, but to the people who are being lost, it's more like a stink. It works both ways, because in the one sense, if it is the good news, then people will be settled by it. If it's bad news, then it is going to cause them great irritation. So he really tells us that the gospel will work both ways. There's no way to know how the reaction is going to take place, but Paul, I think, would say if you're going to worry that some people might be offended by it, then doing nothing and saying nothing at all is going to result in the fact that no one will even have a chance. So he would rather take the risk that some people might be saved and some might be lost. And as he does that, he is also once again pointing out that he himself has been dedicated toward bringing that message. So he concludes this section with saying, we're not peddlers. We're not just peddling our own wares, we're talking about Christ. And you can notice that even though he is defensive, he is never defensive about what a good person he is. He is defensive about how he's carrying out his ministry. He's defensive when he says everything that I do is in light of trying to see how I can bring that message of Christ to others. And that there are human problems for him. He says, when I went to the city of Troas, I was upset because Titus wasn't there, and I was so concerned about him I went on. So he says there are human failings that I have, but these are not human failings that are pointing out that Paul is his own messenger, just putting his own ideas forth, but that he is proclaiming Christ. And thus he's asking the Macedonian or the Corinthian Christians from Macedonia, as he's up there in the north, to come to their senses and not treat him as if he is not a messenger of Christ. So this section he gets very personal. He gets somewhat defensive, but defensive because they are acting as if he's on his own. And he says, no, look, at everything that I've been doing is because of Christ. I'm commissioned. I'm serving him. Listen to me as you would listen to the Lord. Listen to what I'm saying as something that's coming from the Lord himself. I hope that as we continue to grow, that we'll be able to evaluate ourselves and our own ministries and listen to where the Lord would lead us as well. Thank you for continuing the study.